Hi, everybody, and welcome. This is a Kalicube Tuesday special. It was organised for Ben because we had a slight discussion about, is podcast SEO even a thing? I said maybe. Ben said no. Erin said,
of course it is.
So welcome, Ben. Welcome, Erin.
Hi.
Thank you.
Brilliant. You get the song as well. A quick hello and we're good to go. Welcome to the show, Ben and Erin.
It's music to my ears all the time. I got to make that my ringtone. I really do.
Brilliant. Right. And the good thing about that song is you can fit anyone's name into it, as I just demonstrated. First thing I wanted to do was show the screenshots. We're going to be talking about, is podcast SEO even a thing?
Mm-hmm.
And Ben, from your point of view, you're saying basically podcast promotion doesn't majoritarily go through SEO. And Erin is going to argue the case that SEO is a huge help to podcasters, but they don't yet understand that. Is that about a fair assessment?
I
think so.
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, that's the basis of the discussion. And
when do we
if
get to fight about it?
Right after the brand SERP, because I looked up the MarTech brand SERP, if we can have that on screen. And I managed to get the MarTech podcast and the Edge of the Web on the same Google result. So this is obviously Google's knowledge panel understanding of the MarTech podcast and its understanding of the Edge of the Web. And as we know within the SEO world, Google's understanding of the world through the knowledge graph is phenomenally important to your performance in SEO. And then if we look at the next screen, we get the Edge of the Web knowledge panel. Google has understood the Edge of the Web, and we can see that it's understood that it's related to the MarTech podcast, at least in terms of topic.
See, you're brothers. See?
Yeah, you're brothers. Like it or not, you guys are brothers. So that idea of understanding within Google is phenomenally important. If we look at the next screen, we've got my podcast, which actually appears on my brand SERP as both the podcast boxes and see results about. So we're starting to see that podcasts are getting a great deal of visibility in SEO. And I'm afraid, Ben, I'm slightly biased on this, so I'm slightly more to Erin's side, but good luck. You've got to fight your corner. And if you look at the next one, I was thinking about this as potential opportunities for podcasts. Mm-hmm. You've got obviously the blue links for any individual podcast episode. You've also got the video boxes if you put your podcast out on YouTube or Vimeo or similar. And you've got the entity boxes underneath a topical knowledge panel, which here we can see within internet marketing. You've got different blogs and different shows. So lots of opportunities from my perspective. So can we start with you, Ben? As a podcaster coming towards SEO as opposed to an SEO going towards podcast like Erin and I are, where do you promote? How do you get the viewers?
I'll take a step back and just preface this a little bit. So I produce multiple podcasts and market them as well. And one of them is an SEO podcast. Mm-hmm. Now, I am not an SEO by trade. I talk about one like I know what I'm talking about, but let's be honest, Erin's the real SEO and I'm just a talking head, a digital marketing, a content specialist. And the reason why I think that podcast SEO is not a thing, excuse me, isn't what you showed doesn't matter. Ooh. No one's finding podcasts in Google. No one's, yes, Google is looking at the content or looking at all of the properties for a podcast content and surfacing them and every sort of snippet and feature and wonderful. Isn't it amazing that they're starting to put places when someone looks for my podcast's name? Mm-hmm. I run one of the biggest marketing podcasts in the world. No one looks for it in Google. They look for it in iTunes. They look for it in Spotify. They look for it in Overcast. They look for it in one of the thousands of podcatchers. And this is why podcast SEO is not a thing, asterisks, yet, close parentheses, is the SEO content that's being surfaced, like the content that's being surfaced through search, does not drive people to listen to podcasts. Everyone that listens to podcasts finds them in the podcast app store. maybe a little bit in social media, and we're starting to get into programmatic advertising, pushing content to people. But I don't think that the world is sitting around saying, how do I search for podcasts in Google? How do I then click to then listen to them? And if they do, maybe they're listening to one episode, but they're not subscribing because there's no great experience to go from web to podcatcher. And that's why I don't think podcast SEO is a thing, is that it's optimizing on the wrong platform. Great.
Right. No. Sorry, that's an incredibly convincing argument or idea. And Google's actually pretty late to the party. Podcasting has been around forever, and Google's suddenly pitched up pretty late to the party. And you're saying basically it isn't the predominant way that people find and subscribe to podcasts.
Yes, I think that the problem is the podcast experience has primarily been app-based. And there is no connection from search to subscribe, because somebody would have to subscribe in the apps, and the apps that are being used are competitive with Google. Nobody really listens to Google podcasts. They listen to on one of the other podcatchers, and maybe that's changing. But yeah, I think that there's the discrepancy is like, is app SEO a thing?
Oh, that
takes it's kind of the same conversation. It's people are listening to content in a app.
And what you're saying is it's a two-step process. If I find that on Google, there's a two-step process to A, get the app, and B, subscribe. But Erin, what would you say about that? I mean, I think that's pretty convincing.
That is, if you're talking about optimizing in a particular channel. You're absolutely right. If you're trying to reach podcast audience, right, who are apt to more listen than anything else, then you have to optimize in that channel. Point about podcasting is it's an omni-channel broadcast. If you curate it right, you're meeting an audience that doesn't know they want to listen to a podcast. They're actually coming in through search about the topic matter that you're talking about. Then you laterally move them over to being a podcast audience member. So the core of this is, what are we really optimizing? Is it the podcast or the content? I'd argue that it's the content that you're trying to optimize. And that's where omni-channel comes in, where you use your video just like this, you use your podcast audio, you use your content that you put show notes on, you also move it into social. And that's where the brand SERP that Jason was pointing out is a catcher's net, is a drag net of all things that are oriented towards the content. Now, the goal is to be able to get that content optimized and valued enough by Google that it's not about the brand SERP. You're not going to have Edge or any of our podcasts fully unveiled inside of the brand SERP. But your podcast episode could very well be picked up if somebody's typing in a particular piece of search that they're interested in. Hey, there's a podcast going to drop on that show page. And now you're in the funnel of actually getting them as a podcast audience. So it's about curation of the show and also reaching other audiences that are not the podcast audience. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, and that gives me. Oh, sorry, can I just make a couple of points, and then I'll come back to you, Ben. Sorry to interrupt, but it's just really thought of two things. One is promoting the show would be on the podcast platform, and promoting the episode would be potentially on Google. Is number one point, and number 2 point is, Erin, is there a problem with duplicate content because all these different platforms show exactly the same show notes?
No. It's actually bringing the information into focus, because Google's paying attention to the audio lane, the video lane, the true content lane on the web page itself, as well as all the social signals. You're not duplicating it. You're curating it into different summaries and different information based on how you're trying to reach that audience. So it's not just duplicating it into different channels.
Right. Brilliant. Now, Ben, I interrupted you. Off you go.
The way that people consume podcast audio, or audio in general, is in, let's call it a passive sense. Right. I press play, I close the screen, I put the phone in my pocket, and I walk around while I'm listening to the content. People are not sitting in front of their screen while they're listening to the audio. And the problem with the search experience driving to audio is you're sitting there in front of a web page, whether it's on your phone or on your desktop, and it drives you to an experience that basically is a supplemental experience to the audio. Our show notes, we've got show notes and quotes and all of this stuff. So like somebody goes to the Is Podcast a Thing episode on the MarTech pod, if we're going to use that as the example, and they're reading all of the stuff that we talked about. It's got all of the links that we mentioned in, that episode. But the actual audio experience is not designed for that. Right. It's designed to be in-app, quick, press play and make it go away. And so basically when Google is presenting every podcaster's show notes or that supplemental page, they're saying, here's the interesting stuff that you need to know now that you've listened to the podcast. By the way, good luck going and finding the audio content or having it in an experience that is an engaging, immersive experience that audio is meant to be, right? It's ears only, not eyes. And so that sort of like, that to me is the disconnect. And honestly, when we talk about podcast SEO, my thought is the reason why podcast SEO is not a thing, it's not that Google isn't surfacing the content or, it's not getting into Google's algorithm. It's the connection between the pages that are being served and the audio experience is not a great one. You can't subscribe to the feeds that you want to through a web page, or there's a lot of friction there.
Right.
And also like the bigger point to me is that podcast SEO is actually Apple SEO or Spotify SEO. It's not understanding Google's algorithm. It's understanding what content does Apple want to surface, because that's where people are looking for their podcasts. It's in the Apple App Store. It's in Spotify. And to me, it's like, that's why podcast SEO isn't a thing. Is like, we don't have access to the data, or no one's built the tool to analyze the data in the other podcast specific algorithms.
I would absolutely agree. So it's really about what the optimization is. What is it we're really talking about? If you're talking about podcast SEO, you're absolutely right. It's in the audio channels and working the algorithm in that space. If the discussion is podcast valuable to SEO to reach a consumer in any number of different ways, then I would argue that you do need to curate it, because you want to reach that audience that is not in the audio lane. Everybody's got a particular digital consumption profile. You're either a video file, audio file, or your social file, right? You have these different manners in which you consume. I was trying to not trip on that, but you have your own preference of consuming information, right? So the point here is, if you're using podcasts to reach those individuals, then it's a matter of, you've got to reach them in their preferred lane, not trying to force them into podcast. If you hit them with a video, then they come in, see that there's a number of other videos, and also they have that podcast. Then you can pick them up tangentially from that initial medium over to the medium that you're trying to get them as more of a intimate subscriber, right? But I think there's a point of this latticing of get them into one space and then move them to a deeper and deeper relationship with your brand based on their overall digital consumption profile, not just one. So there's the difference. Is if you're doing podcast SEO, you're absolutely right, Ben. It's in that space, in that lane, and it's also a lot of additional promotion to be able to get that visible and bobbling to the surface. But if you're trying to bring them in, right, then there's other ways to do it, and that's actually using your podcast for SEO.
Aaron, I agree with you.
Isn't it a question of packaging as well? Because, I mean, what I've done is I've taken my podcast from an SEO perspective and I've packaged it for Google. And I think one of the reasons I'm not driving vast audiences like you are, Ben, is because I haven't packaged it correctly for the apps. So couldn't I just package it differently for each?
I think that what Aaron said that sticks out to me that's interesting is a podcast valuable for SEO? Yes. Can you search engine optimize your podcast to drive more podcast downloads through Google? No. Or not with great results. Like, sure, maybe somebody's going to Google a podcast and then find it and then go to Apple and then subscribe and then become a listener and then you get the downloads. I think that's the distinction. Do podcasts have SEO value? Yes. can you search engine optimize your podcast in Google? Not really. Like, there's a couple signals that you can look for in, the other more relevant algorithms. What's your number of subscribers? Like, I don't think that there's specific content that we know that you can say, okay, here are the terms I need to include in my titles and tags, like you would in Google in the Apple App Store. We don't have access to that data, and that's why I say no. Podcast SEO is not a thing. Not can you optimize a podcast for SEO results.
And within the apps, the reviews have an awful, especially in Apple, that they have a big weighting or not?
Yeah,
am I mistaken?
I actually think so. The signals that people look at that I can tell, one is, there is a content component to this. When people look for the MarTech podcast, even before we had a lot of reviews or a lot of, subscribers, when people were looking for MarTech and we're MarTech podcast, we were showing up, number 2 from day 1 5 years ago. And that's SEO, right? Like, our content is serving a need that people are looking for. I think the signals are reviews. I think reviews are less important now than they've ever been. I think the velocity of new subscribers with recent reviews is important, but I actually think getting new people to click the subscribe button, and it's the metrics that, from what I can tell, that the podcast app stores are optimizing for is new listeners, new subscribers, a certain threshold of reviews and credibility, age of your podcast, right? How long have you been doing this? Probably content volume for credibility as well.
Yep.
And it's really hard to say, like, what content is, are the app stores, is Apple looking for? That's, to me, where, like, the SEMrush's, Ahrefs, the world's, like, somebody's hopefully going to go build a podcast SEO tool and look at all of the ranking results in the podcast app store and build a tool saying, here's the keywords you should include in your podcast titles. Like, that's the part that the podcast industry is missing. It's the data and research part. So, if anybody wants to go build a podcast SEO platform, I would be your first user.
Hey, Ben, let's go talk off show. We might have an idea here. How about that?
I mean, I've done an episode about how, on the Voices of Search podcast, on how to build a podcast SEO platform. It's just prohibitively expensive to do all the scraping. And,
Right, brilliant. But that's an invitation that Ahrefs, SEMrush, and the other platforms probably won't be able to resist, because as this moves forward, it's going to become more important.
Let's just build it, and we'll be the podcast SEO company.
Hey, off we go. Well, it's you and Erin, not me. I'm just sitting in the middle. But
no, you're in.
Thank you. But what I do like about that is the subscribe action is something they can track incredibly well, and the unsubscribe action, whereas Google doesn't have that within the search results, at least. And as you say, Google Podcasts isn't very important. It doesn't even particularly rank well in Google itself. Apple outranks it. So that kind of information they're getting is subscribing and unsubscribing is incredibly accurate, and therefore, I would imagine, incredibly powerful.
What's the opposite of aggregation? Is it disaggregation? Deaggregation? Like
fragmentation.
Oh, brilliant. Erin, genius.
Erin went to college.
He did, didn't he? And he came back. Okay. Sorry. So fragmented.
Now I have to earn a living. Yeah.
The podcast landscape is very fragmented.
Yep.
Right. We're looking at search in 1994, right? Where Yahoo, AOL, Netscape, all the Lycos, they all have their own search provider and different levels of market share, but there is no Google that owns 95% of the landscape, right? For a lot of our podcasts, because we tend to be Apple centric, we see about 70% in the Apple ecosystem. So that's the algorithm that matters the most to me. But, 20% for Spotify, 8% for Overcast, and then there's a million other podcast players that are out there, and each podcast has a different mix. So the problem here is that there's so many different algorithms that are surfacing your content, and it's not in a uniform experience to find the content. What you look for when you type in MarTech in Spotify, there might be a rapper named MarTech, Probably not. But he's going to show up along with the MarTech podcast content. He or she would show up, in that experience because Spotify has music and podcasts, right? It's showing up in the same algorithm. Apple is different. So everyone's algorithm is set up a little bit different. And there's so many podcatchers that are out there that not as simple as the SEO landscape, which is, if you're bored, you might start thinking about Bing, but really you kind of care about Google and Google only.
You're absolutely right, Ben, and it's actually very much still in its rudimentary stage. And we've had these conversations before, is that everything that we see on the digital landscape from metrics boils down to like 3 or 4 factors of just performance understanding inside the podcast itself, let alone the rudimentary factors, just like you're talking about. If everything's matched up with those basic factors of frequency of content, the engagement, the velocity of subscribers, you're going to get blown past by a celebrity that has some of the key names that are branding points that you do. It's too rudimentary. It's too juvenile a environment to really bank on. But I mean, to your point, these factors still work towards bubbling you up to the top of your channel. So you still have the channel aggregation inside of, or I should say category aggregation inside of Apple, inside of Google to a lesser degree, that you can still optimize and get to those spaces, right?
Sorry, Jason, you want to go?
No, I was actually sorry. The reason I was looking off screen is because I've just looked at my own data, because I haven't done that, obviously. And web browsers get 12%, and mobile applications get 77%. And personal assistants get 3%, and Apple represents a little over 50% overall, and that includes all the web browsers and all the rest of that stuff. So I'm kind of looking. I'm actually now realizing, as we're talking this through, is that I'm putting a lot of effort into my SEO efforts that simply do not pay back in terms of the listens I'm getting. And Ben's going to say, told you so, told you so.
No,
sorry,
but
you're right.
Look,
I'm with you, Ben. I'm with you.
Oh, come on, back over here.
Can I tell you some secrets? Can we just keep it between us girls?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And
everybody listening, cover your ears for a second. Apple released new metrics in Podcast Connect, which is how you evaluate your podcast according to Apple. And they started releasing not only the number of downloads and where they come, but the listeners, and I think they call them followers, and then subscribers to Apple is somebody who is paying for your content. But this follower metric is what most of us think of as subscribers, somebody that's gone onto my podcast page in the App Store and said, I want this content in my feed on the daily. And so the metric that matters the most for boosting you in the App Store, if we're talking about App Store optimization, content, great. Apple hasn't really shown anybody like how they can optimize for content. Nobody knows how to do that, and we have to build a tool for it. The metric that matters is followers. Great, we know what metric to optimize for. Now, not only do you have to get somebody into the App Store, you have no visibility into what content that they're seeing. You don't know if they've played an episode, but you're supposed to drive them to not only play the episode, but follow your content. And if you can get somebody through those 3 blind hurdles, then Apple's going to give you a boost in their rankings and you'll start to get more organic traffic. I would call that SEO. So I honestly think that the level of sophistication in podcast SEO right now is not on a tokenized keyword basis like in Google, where you could say, I want to target these specific keywords with this specific content, and here's I'm going to rank for it. It's I'm going to optimize for getting people to click the follow button, but I don't know anything that happens after I drive them into the podcast app store.
Right.
So if you can find a way to drive followers, you can boost yourself in the rankings and actually get some organic traffic.
And that's where programmatics come in. That's where the advertising factor comes in, to be able to reach those audiences that are apt to play. I mean, the ad insertion into audio aggregators. And that's where you're bound to be able to find and be able to set the hook on individuals. So those ad platforms are specializing in their audiences more and more. And Ben, you're the specialist at that, to be able to reach those individuals, because that's the only game in town to be able to boost those iTunes signals, right?
Yes, a marketing vendor who I use religiously, love dearly, launched a subscriber, like pay per subscriber or pay per follower product in beta, or it might even be in alpha, and we're testing it this month. But basically what they've seen is on some relatively large successful podcasts, they've been able to go from, hey, we're a top 50 podcast, to we're outranking the daily for news, you know, like number one in a category with a relatively low amount of investment, right? If it's $5 a subscriber, people are spending a few $1,000s to go from I'm in the ranking to I am the top of the App Store, purely just optimizing for this follower metric. And to me, like that shows that what's the most important thing in Apple's algorithm? How many followers are you getting? Doesn't matter what the content is, doesn't matter your reviews. It's, are people clicking the follow button, asking for your feed, your content in their feed?
And that's kind of them looking to the walled garden, as all of these platforms are. They're saying, as long as people are subscribing, then we've got them more within our app. We keep them more. Social platforms do that. Google do that. Apple do that. So kind of a lot of this comes down to just playing the game of the platform you're trying to optimize for. And in Apple's case, it's categories, or the category that somebody might be interested in, interest topics, and number of followers. And it's a pretty easy system to game.
It is. Oh, well, with how easy
there's one metric that matters. I don't know if it's easy.
No.
Sorry, I was paraphrasing.
But Jason, the other side of it is that Google wants you in its platform as well. It's developing the SERP as the platform, and not they're trying to intend to create an environment that you don't have to leave to go listen to a podcast on the podcast player. And that's where the SERP is a good deal more volatile. And we're seeing play buttons for audio bubbling up to the top of these SERP, the SERP real estate, right? So Google's going through parsing audio now. In fact, Spotify just released just teamed up with a new ad agency to be able to analyze all audio inside of each and every episode, to be able to flag any type of inappropriate or topic matter that an advertiser does not want to be part of, and is giving feedback in an environment so they can actually decide, well, I don't want to be heard in these particular episodes, as opposed to the entire brand. So the AI is getting much more oriented towards understanding what you're talking about at the episode level. Okay. Google's parsing through video and inside of the YouTube channel, and being able to actually timestamp relevant topic information as it applies to what you're searching for. So it's giving all this information in the SERP itself. And that's where we are in the space of, we're not in podcast promotion nearly as much as we're in the space of how do you optimize your content to be able to fit the needs of that SERP real estate. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And one of the reasons that podcast optimization for these platforms is, as you were saying, 1994, 1998 kind of style, is because the technology to analyze and understand what it is people are saying hasn't been there up until now. But now it is, Ben. Do you think that's going to change as these platforms analyze what we're saying, understand what we're saying, and can then optimize on the content much as they would for text?
I'll go back to my original statement of none of it matters when it's web-based in search. It's wonderful. It's wonderful that Google is optimizing and understanding the content and highlighting it, and it's going to drive people into a web-based, text-centric, like go to a landing page experience.
Right.
And that's just not how people consume audio. And even if they are consuming it, it's on a per episode basis. Right. Not on a subscriber basis, which gets people into these feeds, right? It's about following and listening regularly, which is what drives the volume. That's what matters for podcasters, right? Their audience, not their listeners, are what matters. Like, I care about the people that follow and listen to multiple episodes, not somebody that's like, oh, I care about them, but less somebody that's listening to an individual piece of content. And Google's experience right now is, here's an individual piece of content. It's like, that's nice, but I can't track you, retarget you, get you into my audience. So you're kind of like walking by my storefront. You're not coming in the store.
And you're hearing the PA system play some funky disco music as you walk by, right?
Yeah, most of it's hip hop.
So, I mean, the secret then to getting a podcast and getting traction is to get that flywheel effect going within individual platforms, especially Apple. I mean, what are the Android platforms that we can target? Because Android's massive and yet isn't a big podcast.
No, I think that it's to use Aaron's word, very fragmented. I think that Spotify is probably the first platform right there, according to them, the biggest podcast platform, and according to everyone else, the second biggest. I think that there's apps that are pulling the RSS feeds from Apple, like I use Overcast, Player FM, Stitcher, right? There's thousands of podcast listening experiences, and everybody has their own flavor. So my feeling is Android is a lot of 2 to 5% of your audience apps, and Apple is more aggregated into a single app, and then Spotify kind of covers both.
To your point, Ben, it's really about the platform loyalists as well. You have Spotify loyalists, you have Overcast loyalists, you've got Stitcher loyalists, and you have the ability to move ads inside of all of those different platforms, much greater than Android or the Google the Google podcast environment. So it's a fragmented but very niche group of listeners in all of those, and you can really compound that and be able to have a much better series of metrics to perform if you're actually reaching all of them, as opposed to just staying inside of Apple, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know how each individual podcast app is differentiated. They all kind of feel very much the same to me, and I think a lot of it is the listening experience. Like I said, I listen to my podcast in Overcast because I think the user experience is great, but it also integrates nicely into not only the iOS, my iPhone, my iPad, but also into the car. And so, I like that experience better than I like the default Apple podcast experience. I'm sure everybody's a little bit different, and there's, little features here or there, but it doesn't seem like there's huge differentiators between the different apps.
But they do have their own unique ad engines that you can capitalize on, and you can have some specialized audiences inside there, right?
Yeah, I've heard great things about Acast, where you can advertise specifically in Acast, but since it is in an app environment, I think it's Acast. They're not only allowing you to buy ads on a CPM or just a sort of run of network basis, but you can actually pay on a per follower, per subscriber, which I think is interesting. I wish Apple, I can't believe I'm saying this, and it's totally counterintuitive to sort of their public facing persona, which is privacy, privacy, privacy. So we don't like advertising. We don't want people to have your data. We don't really like marketers. I wish Apple would launch an ad network. So instead of me going through 10 different vendors to try to buy podcast listeners, I'd rather be able to promote my podcast in the podcast app store. And Apple hasn't gone down that route yet.
No.
Right. What I get from all of that, I mean, to kind of let's wrap it up, is that my mindset is very much on Erin's side, which is SEO. And if I want to make a success of my podcast, I need to change mindset and get into the app mindset of where my audience are and get them to subscribe and to follow, rather than think on a per episode basis, think on a show basis. So can you just wrap that up for me, Ben, on a podcast?
I think you can use your podcast to have important, meaningful SEO results. I think you could take your content, you can summarize it, turn it into blog posts, show notes and quotes, surface the content. You can do podcast schema and all the SEO stuff we all want to do, and get your pages out in front of people on Google. I think they're going to consume the content from those pages. I don't think they're going to be podcast subscribers. They're going to be content consumers. So if you care about SEO results, your podcast can be very important. If you're using your SEO results to try to drive podcast listeners, I think you're climbing up a hill that doesn't exist.
Brilliant. And that's absolutely brilliantly said. I couldn't have imagined anybody saying it better. And I'm going to use that as a quote at some point further down the line. Erin, closing comment from you?
Certainly. Ben's absolutely right. And it really is inversion of the words. SEO for podcasting or podcasting for SEO. Ooh. Right. There's the wordplay there. So if it's podcasting for SEO, there's something very unique in this space, and that is the natural language processing and the semantic subject matter that naturally occurs when you're having conversations that cannot be fabricated to any degree of authenticity. So if Google's actually paying attention to relationships of subject matter, then podcasting is a natural way for those topics to exist in kind of its own ecosystem, as opposed to trying to force content together that may or may not have the right tone or the right connections, but inside of a conversation, you better believe that the script that we followed here, the conversation, there's an interplay of several very nuanced concepts, and you curate this, transcribe it, and then parse this apart into different areas. The relationship of those contents, the content is a very strong factor for Google to pay attention to. So if you're using the podcast to be able to make those relationships of content and then move them into the ecosystem, Google's getting a better understanding of who you are as a brand and what you're talking about and the subject matter that's very, very, very relevant to its users. That's what podcasting for SEO is all about.
That was absolutely brilliant. I love both conclusions. Thank you so much. I'm now sitting between the two of you, and I can't decide whose side I'm on. I think I'll just be on both of your sides.
Over here. Absolutely. See. Oh, see. Where am I going? Oh, my gosh.
Oh, that way.
Oh, we're podcasters, not video production.
Thanks a lot, everyone, for watching. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Erin. That was absolutely brilliant. Anton behind the scenes, we didn't see much of him. I'll see you next week on Kalicube Tuesdays for the normal, everyday Kalicube Tuesdays, as opposed to this special edition. Thank you so much. Kalicube. It's all about your brand search.